Good afternoon. Today's diversity professionals group topic is cultural humility, the great mitigator. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to go over a few housekeeping items. My name is Joanna Brown, and I will be the webinar organizer for today. We want to make sure that today's presentation is extremely valuable for you. So we ask that you submit all questions by clicking on the question button in the control panel and typing your question. Our speaker today is James Knight, Vice President for Equity and Inclusion at St. Edward High School. James leads the development of vision and strategies that champions the importance of value of a diverse and inclusive community. Part of his work involves engaging faculty, staff, and students in order to make the school a culturally safe environment. In his role, James assesses the potential barriers to inclusion and diversity, develops strategies focused on recruiting and retaining a diverse community. Annually, he designs training programs on cultural competency, cultural humility, cultural safety, and a wide array of topics designed to increase awareness and support of diversity and equity. In addition to his work at St. Edward, James Knight works with a variety of organizations and leaders across the country as a diversity and inclusion strategist. Much of his work is centered on assisting organizations in developing a cultural humility framework in order to create culturally safe environments. And now I present to you James Knight.
Thank you, Joanna. I appreciate the opportunity to be here to share some of my research and just some of the things that I've been doing over the last 6 years. So today I want to talk to you about cultural humility, the great mitigator. So my introduction, I'm going to read a couple of things. And the way I kind of see cultural humility and the way we kind of frame it out with organizations that I work with, especially St. Edward High School, where I'm the Vice President of Equity and Inclusion. But a great way to frame cultural humility is that cultural humility is a way of leading and managing self, and that self would include implicit personal biases that we are either aware of or unaware of. And a big part of that involves us tapping into what I would call our highest self, especially in diverse situations that we can create, influence, and sustain culturally safe environments where others can bring their best self. So cultural humility is a strategy in which you're going to be able to effectively manage yourself and lead to the highest possible ability so that you can be able to bring out the best in others. And a big part of that deals with environment. Cultural humility is a posture of the heart that shows up in how you live, lead, and listen. Culturally humble people recognize the value in others, and therefore they are always looking for ways to inspire, connect, check in, and elevate those that they touch or those that they serve. Just the genesis behind cultural humility, it originated in 1998. There were two doctors who noticed that in the trainings that were taking place within the healthcare field, they felt like it was lacking something that would really cause doctors to be a little bit more culturally sensitive. And so one of the things that the two doctors began to notice is that they felt like the diversity training that was happening in the healthcare field, they felt like it led to further stereotyping. In other words, they said it was focused on cultural competence. And they felt like cultural competence, it led to doctors or healthcare professionals being possibly arrogant. It led to generalizing to where they maybe felt as if they knew all that they needed to know from taking a class. So they felt cultural humility was a great alternative. One of the examples that they talked about in a seminal article is they talked about how there was a nurse working with a Hispanic patient. And so while this nurse is working with this Latina patient, the nurse is struggling to really connect with the patient. And one of the reasons that the nurse is struggling to work with the patient is that the nurse is going back to the things that she learned in the class. In the class that she had, cultural competency training, the class talked about how Latino patients have a higher level, they overexpress pain, right? And so one of the things that was interesting about this scenario is that the doctor was there, and the doctor was someone who was Latino, um, and the nurse never took the time to consult the doctor. The nurse never took the time to really talk to the patient. And so the nurse was making assumptions, and it created a dissonance or a disconnect, which what these doctors would argue made it difficult for the nurse to effectively serve or treat the patient. And so what they came up with this whole idea of culture humility, which they feel a big part of that is that whoever you serve, that you have a responsibility to create like a partnership with the people that you're serving. Um, the way that they would define culture humility, particularly in their article, they define number one as lifelong learning and critical self-reflection. In other words, culture humility is having this posture of a student where you're embracing this spirit of always learning. You never arrive at an endpoint. And another big component of culture humility is self-critique. The second thing that they talk about with culture humility is that a big part of culture humility is also recognizing and redressing power imbalances, especially those that are inherent in the client and professional relationship. And so we have to understand that in the work that we do, that the things that happen outside our jobs, outside of the schools, that these power imbalances come into our particular situations. And so they can affect how we relate. And so a big part of culture is finding ways in which we can connect so that we can be sensitive of the power imbalances, because the power imbalances can sometimes stop those that may be from particularly marginalized communities from being honest and being able to really be a part of creating their solution or their healing. The third part that the doctors talk about is that whatever you require for a person, you must require for the organization or the institution. And there must be institutional accountability. So while we're doing trainings and we're doing cultural sensitivity, diversity, whatever you name it, while we're doing all those things, we must make sure that we're holding the institutions responsible for reflecting these principles and practices. So one of the things that in that article that the doctors talked about how identity is very complex. In other words, we have conjoint memberships, right? There are several things that make me who I am. I'm African American, I might be Christian, I'm married, I'm a male. So we have these different roles that we are a part of, but it's up to us, it's up to me to determine what I want to be called, how I see myself. And so a big part of culture humility is understanding that people have a right to name themselves. They have a right to tell us who they are and what's most important to them. There's also this idea of intersectionality that we should be sensitive to when we're dealing with people on our jobs or in organizations. Okay. So what the doctors begin to talk about is that culture competence, what they felt is that it stresses like that there's this endpoint of learning, and culture humility goes counter to that, and it's saying that you never ever become an expert in another person's shoes or another person's culture. So you always have to be a student, which means that you have to always be asking questions, um, finding ways in which you can just sit, listen, study, and let people teach you about themselves. Okay, so culture merely says learning and respecting different cultures is not a one-time lecture or conference, but it's a lifelong process. So when we're trying to bring this framework into schools, into organizations, we have to understand that this is a long commitment, that this is not just something that we can just do a couple times and say, all right, we're culturally humble. No, we have to be committed to this, that this is a lifelong process. So another way to look at this is that culture is dynamic, it's complex, it's a moving target. Early on, even from the academic level, sometimes we saw culture as something that was frozen, right? When we did diversity trainings, we may have saw culture as kind of being static in the sense that, all right, I'm gonna give you the normalized behaviors of this particular group. And nothing's wrong with that. But as a father, and I don't know about those of you who are watching, every generation culture is shifting. In fact, it's shifting day by day, right? So let me give you this little chart that you can see in front of you, right? So just the way we view culture, right? From culture competency, if we look at it from a more traditional sense, it sees culture as having group traits. And when we see culture as having group traits, sometimes that can lead to stereotyping. So culture humility says that culture is unique to the person. Yeah, I may be black, but doesn't mean that the things that we may think are normalized behaviors of African American doesn't mean that I ascribe to that. Doesn't mean that that's reflective of me. I could be raised in a different environment. I could have had numerous experiences that would make me value different things than what people may see through media, on TV, and so forth. When we talk about culture definition and culture competence, minority is what comes to mind, racial groups. But in culture humility, it's a lot more complex. It's understanding the intersectionality, the complexity of ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, class, faith. All these things are intertwined to really make us who we are. And so culture humility is coming into this situation with people from an interpersonal place saying that, okay, I need to let people teach me about who they are. Yes, it's good to go through cultural competency training where I learn about the group behaviors and so forth. But ultimately, if I really want to know what someone values, what they believe in, I need to make the time to sit and to talk to them, right? If we look at it in terms of traditions on your slide in front of your screen right now, you'll see that in culture competence, um, we see tradition belonging to immigrants, to minorities, right? Whereas culture humility is saying that everyone follows a tradition, right? Um, let's look at context. In culture competence, majority is the normal. Other cultures are what we would say are different. But in culture humility, it's kind of flipping that, right? Power difference exists and must be recognized and minimized. So a big component of culture humility really goes to that um, we'll go to the fact that it's it's an ongoing life process. Whereas I think what the doctors were arguing is that they were experiencing it was more of a defined course, right? If I took this course, I could kind of figure out what I need to figure out from other people, okay? Whereas culture humility is saying, nah, like I really need to put the focus on the individual versus the group, okay? Um, so let's look at this right here, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, okay? So in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I want you to look at it from this place of Maslow's hierarchy of inequity, okay? So when we have people coming into our organizations, they're coming into our schools, our jobs, whatever that might be, the first thing that we need to know is, are the needs being met, right? And so Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what we really would like to see is we would like to see people reaching self-actualization, reaching the top of that pyramid. But before that can happen, there are certain needs that need to be met at the base level. And if we look at the middle two levels that deal with safety, security, love, and belonging, a lot of those things are based on environment. And so cultural humility is one of the ways in which we can build safe environments. Let's look at it from the school level, right? Schools have made it very important that schools are safe, that when people come into our schools, they're going to be safe. But have we thought about how schools would be culturally safe? Even on your job, have you thought about, is my job or my place of employment, the place where I serve, is it culturally safe? Do people, when they come, do they feel like they have to assimilate? Do they lose their identity? Do they lose themselves? Or are they culturally safe, really bring their true self and bring their best self so that they feel like they belong? When those things are in place, then people can bring their full potential, right? People are more apt to share. And so culture humility is a way in which you can create a culturally safe organization, a safe environment where you celebrate and you honor the differences that are there so that people are able to bring their best self into the situation. Okay. So let me begin to look at cognitive biases, because a lot of times what makes it difficult for people to bring their best self is that biases show up. Some of these biases we're aware of, some of these they're implicit. But let me tell you a little bit about cognitive biases. So on your screen, you may see 2 plus 2. If I were to ask you what's 2 plus 2, immediately your mind says 4. That's your mind operating very quickly. If you look at this slide here, and I were to ask, what do you see? What kind of emotion do you see? Most people would say anger, frustrated, right? And you didn't have to take too long to think about that or try to figure that out. You was kind of able to do that pretty quickly, okay? And so what we understand is that our brains, our minds kind of have two systems, right? System one is very fast, it's quick, it's automatic, it's intuitive, even emotional at times. And so what I was tapping into was your system one when I actually was 2 plus 2. It was quick, it was automatic. When you saw that face, right, you could sense the emotion right away. And biases usually sometimes show up in system one. System two is more reflective, it's slow, it's deliberate, it's logical. Okay. And so if I were to ask you, to give you another example, which line is longer, your first mind might say, if you haven't seen this before, the top line is longer. But in reality, the lines are actually the same. Okay. And so when we look at how stereotypes, how biases show up in relationships, they show up in communities, they're implicit, they're quick, right? And so culture melody kind of helps to mitigate that. Okay. One of the biases I want to talk about right now is this availability bias, right? The availability heuristic. And so it judges the probability of events by how quickly and easily examples can come to mind. So you have this little dot, right? Then you have all blue, okay? And so the blue is kind of like what's really going on in the world. But that pink dot, that's kind of what we've been exposed to. And this is what happens, right? This is why people make stereotypes, because people have very limited experiences. They've been, maybe they grew up in like a bubble, haven't been around other cultures. Maybe they've never been put in a situation where they have to learn or listen. And so what happens is when you have to make a decision about how you feel, how you might see someone, you make it off of very limited information. And so these things show up because they're quick, they're vivid. Maybe you saw something on the news and you're like, wow, that's what they're like. Okay, let me tell you about another one. Let's say representative bias, right? It's a mental shortcut that employs the use of past experiences to guide decision making. So you see this picture right here. You see the guy twice, essentially, right? But just notice one slight adjustment might make you see him differently, right? Because glasses are sometimes associated with sophistication, clever, smart, intelligent, right? And so just by putting the glasses on his face, now he represents someone that we might trust to do something that we might consider hard. Okay. And think about this on the other end of the spectrum, that sometimes we stereotype men of color because of certain things that they might have on and so forth. And so these biases show up, and part of it is because our mind likes to find quick ways to make decisions. Okay. So we have to be conscious of this so that we can find ways to mitigate that. Let me give you an example. Let's say, all right, I work at a Catholic school. Um, let's say Rob attends St. John, and then he's on the Cleveland Voucher. The Cleveland Voucher is a program where students, based on where they live, based on their neighborhood, they receive assistance. They receive state assistance to be able to help pay for their private school tuition. So if I code this story like this and kind of say Robertson St. John, he's on the Cleveland Voucher, he travels to school by bus every day, he loves listening to rap music, and in his spare time he's always playing basketball. When I color it that way, and I were to ask you, is Rob a black kid? Is he a white kid? You know, based upon the world we live in, because we say voucher, rap, basketball, we might assume that Rob is African American, but in reality, there are more kids that are not black that are playing basketball that are consuming rap. And so this is just another example to further illustrate my point, why it's so important that we like embrace this culture of humility and this humility of self. Okay. I'll give you another cognitive bias, confirmation bias, right? It's the tendency to search for, to interpret, um, and to recall information in a way that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. So we were all raised in homes, environments where people told us stories, right? We have these narratives that we grew up believing, and if we're not careful, right, we'll hear things, but we'll look for certain things that confirm what we believe. And they say that if you keep looking for something, then you'll find what you look for. So if I'm looking to see that this person is suspicious, maybe because there's this thing in the air about a particular group of people, that they're lazy, that they don't have the same values. So I'm looking for ways to affirm, right, or confirm these stereotypical ideas and beliefs that I have internally because I only had one narrative. So one of the things that I created in my research to help with trainings and so forth at schools and organizations is this culture humility wheel. And so what you see is you have a wheel within a wheel. Okay. What really gets this wheel going is the center part, this whole idea of others over self. In other words, what I'm saying is that relationships must be at the center of what we do. So when we talk about diversity and inclusion and just training people, we have to stress that relationships are important, that if we put others over self, it will make relationships stronger. There's a quote, and I enjoy this quote, it's by C.S. Lewis, and the quote talks about how humility is not thinking less of yourself, but it's thinking of yourself less. And when people know that you make time for them, right? That you make time to think about what they might be feeling, you make time to hear them out, it causes them to open up, right? Um, and then surrounding this whole idea of others over self within our organizations, we must be continuously improving and create a culture where people are open to learning, right? And it is when we have that desire to learn that we can gain more cultural knowledge, which we can use to apply. Okay. Um, then from there, humility, right, leads to flexibility or adaptability, right? And that's so key in the world that we live in today, right? A big part of culture humility is understanding that it's okay to not know. And some people struggle with that, right? Some people feel like they have to know everything. And with culture humility is embracing the spirit of humility, saying that I don't know everything. I don't really know about you, and that's okay, right? Oftentimes, you know, you can never really know about someone that you meet, right? You read books, you watch movies, um, but how are you going to know unless you take the time to talk to them, right? And so one of the things that we've seen in 2020, that in order for us to be relevant, in order for us to be um, just successful and have longevity, we have to have the flexibility to be able to pivot when things shift. And I believe that humility gives us that capacity that we're able to pivot, especially in diverse situations, right? Aristotle considered humility like the median. It's like the balance, it's the midpoint between pride and self-deprecation. Okay. So like the art of life is a constant readjustment to our surroundings. And so when we're training people, when we're trying to equip people, we have to prepare them that we're lifelong learners. And the only way you're going to be a lifelong learner is if you're a humble person. Okay. So point number two of that culture humility world talks about like self-awareness. Okay. And well, the way I see self-awareness, right, as I said earlier, self-critique is really important. Okay. So we have to be self-critical, right? We have to be critical of self. Okay. Um, and so while being critical of self, what I'm saying is, do you have an accurate picture of who you are in different situations? Okay. So um, I think sometimes we like to focus on the greatness about us, but sometimes we don't look at the ugliness. That the reality is that there are some things that we might have to unlearn. There are some blind spots that we have. There are some things that we have to do some hard work in to really begin to bring out our best self, right? I like to say this, like your greatest enemy is not those around you. Your greatest enemy is your inner self, right? It's understanding that there's a part of you that sometimes will fight your growth. And so when we're talking about relationships, we're talking about people being in diverse settings and so forth, and people struggling to work together. I can't be so busy that I know about what everybody else is doing that I don't know what's going on in myself. And so we have to continuously engage in self-critique. Organization that can create a safe space for people to fail, for people to be honest, they're putting themselves in a place for people to be able to stretch, right? And so I believe that um, if we take the time to consider the multiple identities that make us who we are, then we'll be able to have greater influence, right? By understanding more about ourselves. And then we could be more aware about how we impact others, okay? So humility is key if we want to continue to learn, right? And listen. And then self-critique is important. And a lot of people don't like to engage in that process, but we have to create a culture where that's okay to do. Um, let's talk about understanding that we all have multiple perspectives. This is a few years ago published this research about how diversity and diverse perspectives increase innovation by 80%, right? That one of the things about understanding multiple perspectives, making room for this, is that not only do we get to see other points of view, but it helps to reduce fear and it brings about greater creativity. One of the things that I'm always stressing is that there are more ways of knowing and there are more ways of seeing, okay? Sometimes those who are in power, let's go back to what the doctors discovered when they came up with this concept of cultural humility, right? The doctor may be the expert in the medical knowledge, but the patient is the expert at what's going on in their body. So we need both knowledges or both intelligences, however you want to call or describe it. We need both of them. If I go into a community that's been oppressed by a number of things, and I'm going in there like I'm the savior, I'm gonna fix it, then I'm in trouble. I'm not going with a humble mindset or humble attitude, right? I know I have my perspective, but the people who live in the community, they have a perspective. The people who are living the experience that they're going through, their perspective is important, and humility embraces all perspectives, understanding that this must be partnership and we must co-create whatever it is that we're seeking to change and improve. The other thing that I would say, learn what is most important. And the key here is most important. Are we open to learning about others? Let's look at it from here, right? Um, Sometimes we're so busy that we kind of think we kind of think we have people figured out. Like I know where they live. Um, I kind of went into the office, I know what they value, but sometimes that can get us in trouble. So to really learn what is most important to someone, you kind of have to talk to them. You got to sit down and really make time to ask questions, right? So we don't really make time to really make room in our heart to learn what's most important and what people value. Okay. Um, I feel like we can empathize better if we really take the time to listen and make room in our life for other stories. And so oftentimes I think the great divide is because people only have what they think and they only have one narrative. And it's important for folks to be able to make room in their life so that they can continue to grow and continue to hear other stories. And then the last part of the will deals with influence. It deals with what are you willing to do to challenge the status quo, right? Are you willing to have difficult conversations? Are you going to speak out? Are you going to show up, right? Are you comfortable with the way things are? And so teach people, everyone at all levels, that we all have a part to play in advocating for equitable change. Okay. I like this quote right here by Albert Einstein. He said, the only thing more dangerous than ignorance is arrogance. And humility is the antidote to pride, to arrogance. Can you teach anyone? Can you really teach someone if they feel like they know already, right? If they feel like I know what I need to know, well, how can they grow? Okay. And so when you're creating a culturally humble environment, you're really preaching, you're really doing the things necessary to tell people it's okay that you don't know, right? It's okay. Right? We're gonna ask questions. We might make mistakes, but it's all right because we're gonna learn, right? And so we don't want to be culturally arrogant. We want to be culturally humble. Being seen and heard can produce a force of healing that you like have no idea how powerful this can be, especially for some communities. There are people in our organizations, there are people in our communities that have never really been heard. They never been seen before, right? And like really hear me, like I know you're like, yeah, I see you, but like, no, you don't really see me, right? And this is what this work is about when we talk about culture humility. and creating an environment where people feel like they belong. Like, do you really see me? Like, can I really be me in this environment? So what we're saying is that cultural humility is one of the pathways that you can create cultural safety, culturally safe environments. Because if I feel like you really see me and you're really hearing me and I feel safe enough to trust you with me, that I can say how I feel. I can say ways in which I may feel like I'm being discriminated against. Now we can create a culture of honesty, a culture of transparency. And when you have a culture of honesty and a culture of transparency, you now have a culture that's ripe for improvement. The reason why a lot of organizations struggle with improving is because no one is being honest, right? And humility is the force. It is one of the key ingredients that creates an honest, transparent culture. Let's say, for example, a teacher says, I want you to come and I want you to tell me, I want you to evaluate me. I'm teaching, I have my class. I go in there, I say, oh, everything is great. And I don't give them any honest feedback. Is that going to help the person, right? How can an organization really grow if there's no honest feedback? But that takes humble leaders, right? And so Coach Humility is key to that. In closing, you know, I would say Coach Humility is a continuous self-study. And so long as you're living, you're going to have to continuously study yourself and find out what things do I need to unlearn, what things I need to learn. I need to understand the importance of like lowering my own sense of self-importance, right? I need to understand that everyone has something to share. We all have different positions, we all have different roles, but because I have a different role, maybe I have a greater salary, it doesn't mean that my perspective is more important than yours. Partnership is key with culture humility. It's about what can we create together. The doctor is the expert. The patient comes in, right? But the doctor has to be humble enough to say, hey, we're going to create this together. I want you to have a voice. I want you to feel safe enough for you to be honest and tell me what's really wrong, right? And maybe tell me what you think might work for you, right? And so this principle is applicable in every situation as pertains to leadership and service. Understanding no one person has all the answers, right? Being cognizant of our body language. Sometimes we don't realize how our body language, how the visuals in our organizations, the things that we have on our wall, how they're sending messages to communities that might cause those communities to feel alienated, that don't feel like they really belong there. And so, going back to what I've been saying throughout this presentation, we must maintain the posture of a student, right? And when we do that, it will help us have greater empathy and really feel what others feel and see what others see. Um, so I'll stop there, just kind of a little general overview. But questions?
Thank you, James. Um,
Did I cut off? Did I cut out?
yeah, your voice never stopped, but you did.
Oh,
Your camera was
all right.
freezing a little bit,
Okay.
like it's doing a little bit right now. But very good content. The presentation still went well. Um, I'm just going to jump in. Thank you so much for sharing this. I've looked a little bit at some of the people that are in the that are attending, and they are falling in the nonprofit and corporate space. And I
Yeah.
wanted to hear some of your recommendations for adapting this to a corporate environment. Um, the sense that I get is that this is something that is both the individual embracing as well as the institution embracing. And so, I wanted to hear you maybe unpack that a little bit more. Is that correct? Or do you see some
Yeah.
additional nuances that I didn't share?
Yeah, yeah. So that's a great question, Joanna. So one of the things I tell the organizations I work with is that leadership is important. Leadership has to model these principles, right? Leadership sets the culture, it kind of set the tone. And so one of the things I think what makes culture humility effective, and even in the book Good to Great, one of the things he noticed about the leaders that were at level 5 was that they were leaders who were humble, because humility creates this posture where you're curious, right? You're intellectually curious, right? You want to know, um, what do you think, right? And so a big part of what has created such a great divide in our nation and country is that there's just one narrative. And so when we're talking about an organization, I really believe the organization has to find a way to be able to diversify the leadership, diversify perspectives. The leader has to model humility to where the leader is open to listening, and you're listening not with the intent just to say I'm just going to do it because I should do it, but you're doing it with the intent to be able to bring about equitable change. I'm
Hmm.
listening because I want you to feel valued. I want you to feel important. And I also want to know where we need to make the adjustments, because I want to make sure that this environment, this company is safe enough for you to really be able to be creative, for you really be able to share your point. And like when I do focus groups and I talk to people, when the organization or the community is not humble enough or safe enough, people stop talking. And so they just do just enough to keep their job, or they show up, but their full self don't show up. Their creative self doesn't show up.
Um, in order for that to happen, there has to, so I'm wondering if cultural humility, if there are some steps that need to occur prior to this being implemented or adopted into an organization.
Yeah, so one of the things that I encourage a listening session. I encourage for leaders to sit and find out who in the organization, who in the organization needs to be heard, right?
Hmm.
What groups are we not serving in the organization? Okay, the best, right? And so I want to make sure that they're being heard. And so one of the things that we did, even here at St. Albert, right? Let me just use where I'm at. So we have a number of constituents. We have our students, we have our parents, we have our alumni. So we brought them in and said, well, we're going to listen to you. Kind of like how businesses say, we're going to listen to our customer. Well, let's listen to those who are in the organization as well. Those who may be from marginalized communities, those who we may feel as though are not a great representation. Let's start listening. And out of those listening sessions, I'm able to take notes. I'm able to get valuable feedback, and then I have to follow through. If I don't follow through based on the things that I heard, and I'm honest to say, you know what, I'm not going to be committed to it, then, we're going to be in trouble. But if people follow through and begin to include people with that process, then I think those are some of the steps that begin to bring you down that path. I think what happens is, what Coach Humility is really saying is that those who may be in that marginalized space, maybe they're minoritized in some particular instance, I want them to be a part of the creation process. So with our parents of color here, we gave them a voice. And by listening and by inviting them to the table, they said, you know what, I feel comfortable enough to really share how I really feel. Now we know we were able to have some victory. And so whether it's nonprofit or corporate, um, each situation is different, but I think there must be some listening, and there must be some safe spaces that are created so that people can provide honest feedback.
So Melanie Myers asks, what is the next step beyond the listening? So once you've heard from the marginalized, what's the next step? The corporate world will tend to default to hearing, but lacking that follow through. So how do we get it to the next step, to committing to applying and taking action? Many of us find ourselves needing to prompt leadership to make these changes, meaning that it's not um, the continuum kind of stops and starts. Like it's not, you know,
Hmm.
they do the listening and they're like, oh, okay. And I would agree that there are times where people kind of fall off from that perspective.
Yeah, I think the next step after you listen is you have to begin to set goals, smart goals. You have to begin to have some type of benchmark goals where you say, you know what, this is what we want to do. If it's representation, if it's certain programs, you have to you now have to begin to go with goals. You also have to begin to look at the data and say, what is the data telling us? Is there quantitative data I can collect? Is there qualitative data that I can be collecting so that I can evaluate that? I think a big part of culture humility is being able to create a transparency, right, within the culture. So that we say, this is where we want to be. We're going to be open about that, right? And
Mhm.
we're going to hold ourselves accountable, right? Because what we're asking people to do on an individual level, we're saying we're going to do it on an institutional level. So now that we've listened, and maybe after that, those listening sessions, they say, you know what? There's no safe space for me to be able to do this as a mother. I created something. You know what? In 3 years, this is what we want to do. And I'm going to be transparent about it, check in with people, and let people be a part of that process, then I think you'll be able to see some change.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Um, Cultural humility requires this self critique. You had mentioned that earlier. Um, but the self critique requires a level of self awareness.
Correct.
And that self awareness requires a managing of oneself. So if you are um, an individual doing this work, working on yourself to be more um,
Culturally
working on
humble.
yourself, yeah, cultural humble. The words are not, I don't
I
know what's,
know.
so
Yeah.
if you are working on yourself to be more culturally humble, um, it sounds like it can come from a variety of different ways. Either you can introduce it by this a practice that you yourself as an individual do as a leader, and also the more leaders that begin to practice this, then it becomes a culture within the organization, like a part of the culture's DNA. Is that what has happened at St. Ed?
Yeah, great question. So one of the things that one of the things that we had to do is when you have people that own it, right? Versus it's something extra that someone does, it's easy for it to fade away. And so because I own it, I study it, I'm looking at it from every angle. Um, let's look at it this way: the culturally, the culturally humble team has been growing every year, right? To where you're getting more and more ambassadors. So, for example, for us at the school, it was saying, let's put a culture humility rubric in place. Let's have conversations with every employee and say, I'm checking in with you. How are you meeting some of these things that will cause us to be a culturally humble school and a culturally humble organization? So we did that with a group of people, not just leaders, but people from all levels, so that it was a partnership, it was a co-creation to say that this is the culture humility rubric, right? We really believe that these values are essential to make us a safe environment for people to bring their best self. And so we're going to check in with it. We're going to begin to have days of reflection, days where we foster these skills where we're being self-reflective, we're engaging in self-awareness. Oftentimes, we just don't make time for it. I don't think that people don't necessarily have the ability to self-reflect or to be self-critical. I think oftentimes we're just so busy with life that we don't make time for it. So the organization is in a place to where leadership values it, to where they can say, we're going to make time to talk about this, right? Let's talk about what it means for you, where you are right now. It's really understanding that people have to be healthy mentally, spiritually, emotionally, all those things play into this diversity, equity, and inclusion space, that people have to be healthy emotionally and spiritually and physically. All of it goes hand in hand, you know?
I think that it's that it requires more than one person. That's what
Correct.
I'm hearing. I know that you've been doing research on this for your doctorate.
Yeah.
How is that going? So I wanted to talk about that. And then also, you did mention that you have a book. Is the book coming out? Should we like plan to look for more information in the spring, or what are your thoughts around?
So early next year, probably around March or so, we'll release the book. It's called Heart, A Journey Towards Culture Humility. And so it's designed, the book is designed to be done in two ways. I can do it independently, which will help me to engage in self-critique, self-awareness, but it's also designed to be done in like small groups, right? So let's say in the corporate environment, you buy this book and it's like a workbook. It's a book slash workbook to where I can look at the lesson, we can reflect on this, we can look at what is stereotype threat for instance. What is stereotype threat? What does that mean? How does it show up at the corporate space? How does it show up in the school? Have I ever participated in? Have I ever experienced it? Have I ever been, subject to it? And then I'm able to talk about it, reflect on it, and then I'm able to set some goals and say these are some things that I think might help to mitigate that and so forth. In terms of my research, it's going really well. One of the things that I've been studying is, we survey people in our community, and we want to know what leader do you think most exemplify culture humility? And then we want to interview, we want to study, we want to observe those individuals that are pretty effective at dealing with certain communities, and we want to kind of study them to find out what behaviors they have, what's their mindset, what is it about them, and then kind of look at that and say, what's the common thread here? I'm studying 10 leaders. What's the common thread among these individuals that students, parents, community members feel most embody the spirit of culture humility?
We talked about how to introduce it, how to get leaders on board. One thing that we haven't talked about is dealing with resistance. Do you
Yeah.
have an example of um, how you dealt with resistance?
Yeah, one of the things that when I came to St. Edward, I really tried to just kind of study and just try to figure out what was the triggers, what was some of the obstacles, and what led me to culture humility is that it was very disarming for a lot of people, to where people were open to the idea of humility, right? Because
Hmm.
humility shows up in so many different spaces, right? I could be a humble person, I could be a humble leader, or maybe I'm only humble with a few things. But what we found is that people are not so defensive when it comes to this idea of humility. Sometimes because people don't know the fullness of some of these terms that we use in this space. If we say white privilege or we use, certain coded language and so forth, sometimes people get very defensive and say, oh, I know what that is. People don't know what I've been through. They don't know my story. And so they don't want to listen. And so, what we found is that when we come at it from a culturally humble place and we kind of introduced this framework, we found that people were pretty open to it because it was safe enough for them to be able to say, hey, I can grow. And it's also saying that no one has arrived. We're all in this together, and it's bigger than this black and white binary, right? It's really about us moving along this continuum so that we can become our best and highest self.
Mm.
Yeah.
We have one more question that came in, and they wanted to know what common threads have you found in your research amongst the leaders that you mentioned.
Yeah, one of the things is this idea of grace. Um,
Mm.
like people who are culturally humble, who represent that, they are emotionally intelligent. I found they have a high level of emotional intelligence where they check in with people. They're in tune, right? Like they make time for people. And so that's a big component that we saw that's a common thread. The whole idea of grace, in other words, they're not so strict that they just write people off, right? So they have this idea of grace to where, you know, let's work together. Let me work with you. Maybe you messed up, but there's grace here for that, right? Another thing is that people who we were studying, another aspect is that they have experiences that help to make them that way. They're not afraid to listen or to go to this concert or read that book. There's certain things that they're doing. And part of it is because people who are high in humility, they're curious. And so they don't mind engaging in things to where they can begin to enrich their life. And so those are some of the few things that we kind of notice. And the other thing is that I'll say this last thing, and then I'll let you go back, is that they're very culturally responsive. In other words, culture merely leads me to information, right? If I'm humble, I'm listening, I'm asking questions, I get information. Well, the next step is what am I doing with that information? And so they're high because they're doing something with the information that they're learning that they're receiving, and they're finding ways to incorporate it into their practice.
So yeah, one more.
Okay.
uh, and this question is by Antoinette Robinson, and it is, what is the intersectionality of servant leadership and cultural humility?
What is the intersection? So how does servant leadership and cultural humility kind of intersect?
Yes,
Okay.
and we need like a very short answer.
Yeah. So I think cultural humility is very action oriented, right? It's not just me going through this process of me trying to reach my higher self. A big component of cultural humility is like, what am I going to do? And so that's the servant leadership model of it. That's how it intersects. Going back to what I said just a moment ago, cultural responsiveness. What practices am I putting in place that are culturally sensitive and culturally responsive, that I'm recognizing and building on the assets of those communities that might not be my own?
Thank you. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Thank you, James, for sharing such great information and insight with us today. And thanks to all of you for participating in today's webinar. I neglected to mention earlier that this webinar was also co-hosted by Cleveland Sherm. And we hope you found this webinar engaging and informative. If you have thoughts to share, please let us know. There will be a survey sent out after the event, and we look forward to seeing you again. For further information about our webinars, please visit gcpartnership.com/events. This concludes today's session. Thank you again.
Thank you.